Hey guys, tonight we settle into the dim, flickering candlelight of history, opening the heavy, dust-laden tome of the medieval world to examine a curious phenomenon that I, as a historian and a theologian, find endlessly fascinating: the permanence of the temporary. It is a profound irony of the human condition that our most enduring institutions often begin as desperate, makeshift solutions to immediate crises, born not of grand design but of frantic necessity. We look back at the medieval era, a time often characterized by rigid tradition and unyielding dogma, yet if we peel back the layers of parchment and stone, we discover that much of daily life was an improvisation, a frantic attempt to patch a leaking reality that somehow calcified into tradition. Consider the town crier, a figure romanticized in our modern imagination as a quaint relic of a storybook past. In the grand theological scheme of communication, where the word is central, the town crier was the secular echo of the pulpit, yet his existence was never meant to be a permanent profession. Initially, he was a creature of emergency. A man handed a bell and a directive to shout because the mill was burning or the tax collector was under assault. In a society where literacy was the jealously guarded privilege of the clergy and the aristocracy, the written word was a silent ghost to the masses. A royal decree pinned to a post was nothing more than an abstract arrangement of ink to a peasant whose understanding of the world was entirely oral and visual. Thus, the town crier became the bridge between the ruling elite and the illiterate populace, a temporary fix for the fatal flaw of mass illiteracy that transformed into a cornerstone of civic order. It speaks to the sociological dependence on the human voice. Once the town realized that a loud man with a bell was more effective than 1,000 silent notices, the role became cemented in the social hierarchy. He became the living news feed, the auditory glue holding the community's information network together. And his bell, a jarring interruption to the natural rhythm of the day, became the pulse of the town. This transition from a temporary emergency measure to a hereditary dynasty of shouters reveals a fundamental truth about medieval, and perhaps human psychology. We prefer the path of least resistance. Why struggle to teach a populace to read when one man can simply yell the truth, or the king's version of it, into the marketplace? It is a utilitarian calculation that sacrificed the intellectual elevation of the masses for the immediate efficiency of the shout. This reliance on sound brings us to another auditory intrusion that was never meant to become a permanent cacophony: the bell. In the theological context, bells were sacred instruments, the voice of the church calling the faithful to prayer, marking the canonical hours and sanctifying time itself. However, the medieval world, in its pragmatic desperation, secularized the bell with an enthusiasm that bordered on the absurd. It began, as many things do, with the simple agrarian need to not lose one's livelihood. A bell on a cow is a sensible, temporary tracking device. But the human propensity for imitation, what we might call the contagion of custom, turned a practical hack into a fashion virus. The logic was dangerously simple. If a bell works for a cow, it must work for a goat, a sheep, a horse, and eventually the most unpredictable creature of all, the human child. One can imagine the exhausted medieval parent, much like a modern one, seeking a technological solution to the perennial problem of the wandering toddler, and finding it in the jingle of a bell. Yet the theological implication here is one of constant surveillance. The bell stripped away silence and privacy, turning the medieval soundscape into a relentless jingle of motion. It didn't stop at utility, it bled into vanity. When the nobility, those peacocks of the feudal age, began adorning their clothing with bells, they transformed themselves into mobile idols of noise, demanding attention not through virtue or deed, but through the sheer auditory disruption of their presence. The jester, the fool, took this to its logical extreme, becoming a caricature of the noisy nobility. But the tragedy is that the noise never stopped. The temporary solution for lost livestock became the permanent soundtrack of European life, a testament to our fear of silence and our need to constantly announce our existence to the void. And if sound was regulated by the bell, sustenance was regulated by the law, specifically the law of bread. Bread in the medieval mind was not merely a carbohydrate, it was life itself, a symbol of divine providence and the body of Christ, yet also the most volatile political commodity. The assize of bread and ale in England stands as a monumental example of legislative immortality born of temporary panic. Famine, the grim horseman that stalked the medieval world, necessitated price controls to prevent the poor from starving and the rich from rioting. These laws were drafted as emergency brakes on a collapsing economy, meant to last until the harvest improved. But power, once assumed, is rarely relinquished. The state discovered that regulating bread gave it a tentacle into the daily lives of every citizen, a way to exert control over the most fundamental aspect of survival. Thus, a temporary decree calcified into a 600-year bureaucratic nightmare. The baker became a figure of suspicion, weighed down, literally and metaphorically, by the heavy hand of the law. The theological sin of theft was codified into the civil crime of the light loaf, and the baker who cheated the scale was not just a criminal but a moral failure, subject to the pillory and public shame. It is fascinating to observe how a law intended to navigate a specific crisis became a permanent cultural fixation, creating a surveillance state focused entirely on flour and yeast. The bread police are a reminder that institutions, once created, fight for their own survival long after their original purpose has faded. We see this same stubborn adherence to the temporary in the very floors medieval people walked upon. The spreading of straw on a tavern floor began as a sanitary improvisation, a way to absorb the spillages of a raucous evening, ale, mud, and unmentionable fluids. It was a clean layer meant to hide the filth, a temporary carpet for a feast. But the medieval mind, perhaps overwhelmed by the sheer squalor of existence, decided that the temporary solution was good enough to be permanent. Rather than cleaning the floor, one simply added another layer of straw, creating a geological record of debauchery. This practice, burying the filth rather than removing it, serves as a potent metaphor for the era's approach to many problems. Cover it up, ignore the smell, and call it tradition. It reveals a society deeply resigned to the presence of dirt and decay, viewing the material world as inherently corrupted. Where the best one could hope for was a fresh layer of straw to separate oneself from the muck. The persistence of these temporary things, the crier, the bell, the bread law, the straw floor, paint a picture of a civilization that was essentially improvising its way through the centuries, turning its panic into policy and its quick fixes into hallowed traditions, a lesson that perhaps we, in our own age of temporary emergency measures, would do well to heed. If domestic architecture was defined by the haphazard accumulation of straw, military and palatial architecture fared little better in its foresight, revealing a profound disconnect between the grandeur of the medieval facade and the chaotic reality of its internal organs. Consider the castle kitchen, a space that one might assume would be the beating heart of the stronghold, designed with the precision of a military operation. Yet the historical record suggests that many of these culinary nerve centers were not born of blueprints, but of catastrophe. A fire, that great scourge of the wooden world, would consume the original structure, or a siege would force a retreat, and suddenly the preparation of the Lord's meal would be relegated to a hallway. a spare chamber, or, with grim hilarity, a room adjacent to the latrines. The theological implications of preparing sustenance next to waste are unsavory, to say the least, yet the medieval mind possessed a remarkable capacity for compartmentalization. The intent was always temporary, a stopgap measure until order could be restored, but human inertia is a powerful force. Once the fires were lit and the routine established, the temporary kitchen hardened into permanence. Servants navigated obstacle courses of defensive architecture while balancing tureens of boiling stew, a daily liturgy of danger that became accepted simply because it was already there. It is a striking example of how the temporary becomes the traditional, simply through the passage of time and the reluctance to disturb the status quo. This inertia was not limited to stone and mortar. It permeated the very legal code that governed the soul and body of the realm. Medieval rulers, often governing by impulse rather than statute, treated the law as a series of reactive spasms. A king, annoyed by the noise of commerce during a sermon, might ban the sale of fish on Sundays. In a rational world, such a decree would expire with the annoyance or the bishop, yet medieval governance lacked a mechanism for deletion. The law remained, joining a sedimentary layer of forgotten decrees, creating a legalistic clutter where prohibitions against throwing snowballs at soldiers sat alongside weighty matters of treason. It brings to mind the theological concept of legalism, where the spirit of the law is suffocated by the letter, but here it was born of bureaucratic amnesia. The populace obeyed not out of understanding, but out of a resigned adherence to the phrase, "It has always been done this way," a mantra that is both the glue of civilization and the chain that arrests its progress. We see this same principle of accidental permanence etched into the landscape itself with the moat. The romanticized image of the castle moat, a shimmering ring of water reflecting the stone walls, began as a frantic, sweaty endeavor to dig a ditch, any ditch, to slow the advance of men with knives. It was a scar in the earth born of panic, but once the crisis abated, the hole remained, and the aristocratic impulse to aestheticize war took over. "Fill it with water," they said, stealing from the river to create a stagnant pool that bred mosquitoes and swallowed laundry. Even when the advent of gunpowder rendered walls and moats largely obsolete, the moat remained, a waterlogged symbol of authority that had long outlived its tactical utility. Maintained for the sake of looking impressive rather than being effective. The social fabric of the medieval world was woven with similar threads of improvisation, particularly in the economic microcosmos of the tavern. Here we encounter the origin of the tab, a concept born of the universal human desire to consume now and pay later. It was intended as a fleeting arrangement, a short-term credit for the forgetful or the slightly inebriated. However, the tavern keeper, functioning as the keeper of the community's secular sins, recorded these debts with a precision that rivaled the recording angels. In a society where death was a frequent visitor, the debt did not die with the debtor, it transmigrated to the air. One can imagine the theological weight of inheriting the sins of the father, taking on a very literal, monetary form. As a young man, inherited his grandfather's ale bill from a famine 3 decades prior. The temporary convenience became a generational shackle, binding families to the tavern in a cycle of consumption and obligation. This porous boundary between the temporary and the permanent invaded the home as well. The presence of livestock within the peasant cottage began as a mercy, bringing chickens indoors to save them from the biting winter frost, but evolved into a domestic symbiosis. The chicken, once a temporary guest, became a roommate, and the architecture of the home adapted to accommodate the clucking, pecking reality of shared space. It speaks to a fluidity between man and nature that the modern world has sanitized away, In the medieval mind, survival required a messy, intimate cooperation with the animal kingdom that permanently altered the concept of home. Perhaps the most indelible mark of the temporary on our modern identity is found in our names. As population swelled and the village of Johns became unmanageable, society applied the band-aid of the nickname. These were descriptive tags: John the Baker, William with the crooked nose, Thomas the Bald, meant to distinguish individuals in the moment. They were functional, brutal, and fleeting. But when the bureaucratic machine of the state and the church began to record these names for tax and tithe, the ink dried and the identity froze. The temporary descriptor became the hereditary surname. There is a profound irony in a modern family bearing the name Bald or Cruikshank, crooked leg, carrying the fossilized memory of a distant ancestor's physical trait or fleeting misfortune. We are walking monuments to medieval improvisation, branded by the casual observations of a village scribe centuries ago. This lack of foresight extended to the very roads we travel. The medieval road was rarely planned. It was merely the path where the mud had been churned the most. Travelers, like water, followed the path of least resistance, and these muddy trenches, created by the desperate need to get from point A to point B, became the arteries of commerce and war. They were terrible, treacherous, and universally loathed, yet they endured because fixing them required a collective will that the feudal system rarely mustered. The suffering of the traveler was accepted as a condition of life, a physical purgatory one had to traverse. Even the symbols of war and nationhood have their roots in the ad hoc. The battle flag, now treated with near-religious reverence, began as a practical necessity to prevent soldiers from killing their own commanders in the dust and chaos of the melee. It was a "don't stab here" sign. Yet the human heart craves meaning, and soldiers began to project their loyalty, their fear, and their hope onto these rags on sticks. The temporary marker became the sacred standard, a transition from utility to idolatry that defines much of nationalism. We see this same explosion of the temporary into the permanent in the calendar of the church and the village. Feast days, initially sporadic reprieves from the crushing labor of the fields, were so embraced by a weary populace that they multiplied like weeds. The tension between the biblical command to labor and the human desire for rest resulted in a calendar where a third of the year was given over to holy leisure, a chaotic mix of piety and partying that no king could fully suppress. It was a victory of the human spirit's need for joy over the demands of economic productivity. And finally, we look to the city itself. Many great medieval urban centers did not begin with a master plan, but as squatter camps, clusters of temporary huts for workers building a cathedral or a castle. They came for a job, they built a shelter, and they simply never left. The temporary camp calcified into a district, then a town, then a city, trapping the haphazard layout of the original encampment in the twisting, illogical streets that charm and confuse us today. The medieval world, in essence, was a civilization built on the refusal to clean up after itself, a testament to the enduring power of the good enough for now solution that accidentally built the Western world. If the chaotic accretion of medieval tradition teaches us about the collective inertia of society, the life of Mary Tudor offers a stark, devastating lesson on the fragility of the individual soul when crushed between the tectonic plates of theology and dynastic ambition. To understand Mary, we must strip away the blackened varnish of the Bloody Mary mythos, a caricature painted by victorious Protestant historians, and look instead at the terrified, resolute girl standing in the wreckage of a royal family. Her story is not merely one of political maneuvering. It is a Greek tragedy played out in the Tudor court, a narrative of a daughter's desperate love for a father who viewed her as a biological failure. and a woman's fierce adherence to a faith that was her only solace in a world that repeatedly tried to erase her. She entered the world in the bitter cold of February 1516, a winter bloom in the garden of Henry VII and Catherine of Aragon. We must remember that before she was the bastard, before she was the tyrant, she was the pearl of the world. The early dispatches from foreign ambassadors paint a picture of a prodigy, a child, who debated Latin with scholars and played the virginals with a gravity beyond her years. For a brief, shimmering moment, she was the center of the Tudor universe, the visible proof of God's favor upon the union of England and Spain. But in the dynastic calculus of kings, a daughter is a placeholder, a gamble. Henry, a man whose ego was as vast as his power, looked at Mary and saw not a child, but a question mark. Where was the son? Where was the stability? The tragedy of Mary Tudor is that her personal history is indistinguishable from the theological rupture of Europe. Her childhood did not end. It was annulled. As Henry's obsession with a male heir metastasized into the king's great matter, Mary ceased to be a beloved daughter and became a living obstacle. We must imagine the psychological horror of a teenage girl watching her father dismantle her mother's life. The annulment was not just a legal proceeding. It was a declaration that Mary's entire existence was illegitimate, a sin. When Henry banished Catherine of Aragon, he didn't just exile a queen, he orphaned his daughter while she was still alive. The cruelty here is breathtaking. Henry forbade them from seeing one another, weaponizing their love to break their wills. The letters smuggled between them, documents of profound piety and heartbreak, reveal Mary's foundational trauma. She learned that earthly love is conditional, and that the only reliable father is the one in heaven. This period of her life, the years of Lady Mary, forged the steel in her spine. Stripped of her title, her jewels, and her household, she was forced to serve the infant Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman, Anne Boleyn, whom she viewed as the usurper. The concubine. It is here that the theologian must pause and admire the terrifying resilience of the human spirit. Mary stood against the King of England, the Parliament, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, refusing to acknowledge her own illegitimacy. It was only after her mother's lonely death, a death she was forbidden to mourn in person, and under the threat of her own execution, that she finally broke. The signing of the submission, acknowledging Henry as the supreme head of the church and her mother's marriage as incestuous, was the darkest night of her soul. It saved her life, but it wounded her conscience in a way that would fester for decades. She survived, but at the cost of a self-betrayal that would drive her later, fanatical quest for redemption. The death of Henry brought no relief, only a shift in the nature of her persecution. Under her brother, the boy king Edward VI, the threat shifted from dynastic to doctrinal. Edward, surrounded by radical Protestant advisors, viewed Mary's stubborn Catholicism not just as political dissent, but as spiritual pollution. The Mass, her lifeline to God and to the memory of her mother, was outlawed. Mary's refusal to yield during these years is often dismissed as obstinacy, but one must see it as an act of existential preservation. To give up the Mass would be to admit that her mother's suffering was in vain, that her own submission to Henry had been for nothing. Her faith was the only thing they hadn't managed to take from her. Then came the crisis of 1553. Edward died, and the Duke of Northumberland, in a gambit of breathtaking arrogance, attempted to bypass Mary and place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. This moment is the climax of Mary's narrative arc as a survivor. By all conventional logic, she should have fled or been captured. She was a middle-aged spinster, isolated with no army and no treasury. Yet she did the impossible. She rode into the heart of the conflict, rallying the country not with gold, but with the sheer, undeniable weight of her legitimacy. The English people, tired of ambitious dukes and shifting loyalties, rose for her. They rose for the Tudor blood. Her entry into London was a scene of jubilant hysteria. Bells rang, bonfires roared, and the bastard was crowned queen. It was a vindication that Mary could only interpret as providential. God had preserved her in the lion's den. God had parted the Red Sea. But, and this is the cruelest twist of history, the skills required to survive tyranny are not the same as those required to rule. Mary ascended the throne with a heart full of scars and a mind fixed on the past. She did not just want to rule England, she wanted to save it. She wanted to wash away the sins of her father and brother, to restore the broken altars, and to reconnect the severed limb of England to the body of the universal church. She viewed her reign not as a political opportunity, but as a divine mandate. And it is here, in the flush of victory, that the seeds of her final tragedy were sown. She was a queen without an heir, a woman of 37 in a time when that was undeniably old, desperate to secure the future of the faith she had fought so hard to keep. She looked across the sea to Spain, to the land of her mother, and saw Philip. To Mary, Philip was not just a strategic alliance. He was the completion of herself, the partner God had sent to help her bear the burden of the crown. She projected onto him all her longing for stability, for family, for love. She did not see the cold, pragmatic Habsburg prince who viewed England as a damp, heretical outpost and Mary as a tiresome aunt. She saw a savior. The English people, however, saw a threat. The announce of the Spanish marriage turned the cheers of her coronation into the murmurs of rebellion. The fear of foreign domination, of England becoming a vassal of the Habsburg Empire, sparked Wyatt's rebellion, a shock that revealed just how fragile her hold on the hearts of her people truly was. Mary stood firm at the Guildhall, delivering a speech of martial courage that quelled the panic, but the trust was broken. She had saved her crown, but she was beginning to lose her people. As Philip landed in 1554, Mary walked toward him with a heart full of hope, unaware that she was walking into a marital and medical nightmare that would define her legacy. She was seeking love and a child. What she would find was a phantom. The union of Mary Tudor and Philip of Spain stands as one of the most melancholy chapters in the annals of royal matrimony. A collision between a woman starving for affection and a man performing a geopolitical calculation. When Philip arrived, he brought with him the dust of the continent and the stiff, ceremonial reserve of the Spanish court, treating the marriage bed as a battlefield where the objective was not intimacy, but an heir. Mary, blinding herself to his detachment, fell into a devotion that was painful to witness. She saw in his polite nods and formulaic courtesies the love she had been denied since the fall of her mother. The tragedy deepened in late 1554 when Mary's body, conspiring with her desperate hope, began to mimic the symptoms of pregnancy. Her menstruation ceased, her abdomen swelled, and she felt the stirrings of life, or what she prayed was life, within her. It was a phenomenon known to modern medicine as pseudocyesis, a phantom pregnancy, where the mind's trauma and desire rewrite the body's biology. To the theologian, this is a heartbreaking manifestation of the connection between spirit and flesh. Her womb became a theater where her deepest prayers were enacted as a physical illusion. The court rejoiced, the parliament prepared legislation for a regency, and Europe held its breath for a Catholic heir who would seal the fate of the Reformation. But as the months dragged on and the appointed time for labor came and went, the nursery remained silent. The humiliation was absolute. Mary had to emerge from her confinement not as a mother, but as a delusional woman whose body had publicly betrayed her. Philip, his duty done and his patience exhausted, departed for the continent, leaving Mary alone with her grief and a kingdom that was beginning to despise her. In the vacuum of her personal life, Mary turned with terrifying intensity to her divine mission. If she could not birth a Catholic heir, she would birth a Catholic England through fire. The subsequent persecution of Protestants, the Marian burnings, must be understood not as the acts of a sadist, but as the desperate measures of a queen who believed she was cauterizing a gangrenous limb to save the body of the church. She believed that by purging heresy, she might finally earn God's favor and the child he had withheld. It was a theology of transaction written in ash. But the smoke that rose from Smithfield did not cleanse the realm, it choked it. The English people, who might have tolerated a return to the old rites, could not stomach the spectacle of their neighbors burning. Mary became a pariah in her own land, isolated by her zeal. Her final years were a slow, grinding dissolution. A second phantom pregnancy in 1557 was less a hope than a symptom of her final illness, likely ovarian cysts or cancer. As she lay dying, she received the crushing news of the loss of Calais, England's last foothold in France, a military failure that she felt as a physical amputation, reportedly saying it would be found engraved on my heart. She died in November 1558, a queen who had tried to turn back the tide of history with sheer will, only to be washed away by it. She left the crown to Elizabeth, the sister she feared, ensuring the very Protestant triumph she had sacrificed her soul to prevent. From the claustrophobic tragedy of the Tudor court, we shift our gaze back across the centuries to a different kind of failed union, one played out on the grandest stage of the ancient world. By 324 BCE, Alexander the Great stood at the zenith of human power, a man who had marched off the edge of the known map and returned with an empire that defied comprehension. He had shattered the Persian Empire, but he was wise enough to know that a kingdom built solely on the sword is a castle built on sand. Alexander faced a problem that has plagued every conqueror since: how to govern a vast, multi-ethnic population without relying on perpetual occupation. His solution was homonoia, a unity of hearts and minds, a fusion of East and West that would render the distinction between Greek and Persian obsolete. He did not want to be a Macedonian king ruling over Persian subjects. He wanted to be the universal king of a new, hybrid civilization. To achieve this, he orchestrated the Wedding of Susa, a spectacle of social engineering that makes modern state propaganda look amateurish. Susa, the ancient Elamite capital, was chosen for its deep resonance with imperial power. There, amidst the glazed brick reliefs and the scent of frankincense, Alexander staged a mass wedding that was simultaneously a religious ceremony and a political directive. He married Statera, the daughter of the king he had defeated, and Parasates, a scion of the previous dynasty, weaving his own bloodline into the tapestry of Persian legitimacy. But he did not stop there. He compelled 80 of his highest-ranking officers, the companions who had bled with him from the Granicus to the Indus, to marry Persian noblewomen in a single, synchronized rite. It was a breathtaking act of hubris, the belief that one could legislate love and biology to serve the state. The ceremony was a sensory overload of Macedonian discipline and Persian luxury, a liturgy of empire, designed to visually manifest the New World Order. The men sat on silver couches, drank from identical cups to symbolize equality, and took the hands of women whose fathers and brothers they had slaughtered on the battlefield. However, beneath the veneer of gold and silk, the Wedding of Susa was a cauldron of resentment. To the Macedonian veterans, this was not a union, it was an erasure. They viewed the Persians as effeminate and defeated, and they saw Alexander's adoption of Persian dress and custom not as diplomacy, but as apostasy. They felt their king was going native, betraying the rugged Hellenic values that had won him the world. For the Persian brides, used as currency in this transaction, the ceremony was a gilded cage, a public submission to the conquerors who had dismantled their world. Alexander believed he was planting the seeds of a new humanity, a master race of mixed heritage that would hold the empire together. But he failed to account for the stubbornness of tribal identity. He was trying to force a cultural synthesis that requires centuries to happen organically, demanding it occur over the course of a single banquet. The fragility of this vision was exposed the moment Alexander died a year later. The empire did not fuse, it fractured. His generals, freed from his overwhelming presence, immediately divorced their Persian wives, discarding the women and the dream of unity with equal haste. The brotherhood of man that Alexander proclaimed at Susa dissolved into the wars of the Diadochi, proving that while a king can conquer the earth, he cannot conquer the prejudices of the human heart. The Wedding of Susa remains a dazzling, tragic monument to the limits of power, a reminder that culture cannot be mandated by decree, and that true unity is a garden that must be grown, not a building that can be erected in a day. While Alexander sought to construct a new world through the forced marriage of cultures, the city-state of Sparta sought to preserve its existence through the forced subtraction of humanity. We turn now to the agoge, an institution often romanticized in popular media as a heroic boot camp, but which, to the historian and the ethicist, reveals itself as a state-sponsored trauma factory designed to excise the individual self. At the tender age of 7, a Spartan boy was not merely sent to school, he was harvested by the state. This moment of separation, the severing of the maternal bond, was the foundational trauma upon which Spartan identity was built. The boy ceased to be a son and became a unit of the polis. He was thrust into a communal existence where the only currency was endurance and the only virtue was obedience. The physical deprivations of the agoge, the single cloak for all seasons, the bed of reeds torn by hand from the Eurotas River, the meager rations, were not merely economic measures. They were theological assertions about the body. The Spartan state viewed comfort as a moral failing, a softness that invited defeat. Hunger was a pedagogical tool. By keeping the boys perpetually on the edge of starvation, the state achieved two ends. It hardened their bodies against the rigors of campaign, and it forced them to become criminals. The encouragement of theft among the boys is one of the most distinctive and disturbing features of the system. A boy was expected to steal to eat, yet if caught, he was beaten mercilessly, not for the sin of stealing but for the sin of clumsiness. This created a moral universe entirely divorced from the rest of Greece. In Athens, theft was a crime against the community. In Sparta, it was a tactical exercise. The goal was to produce a soldier who was essentially a high-functioning sociopath, capable of independent action, deceit, and ruthlessness, yet paradoxically bound by absolute loyalty to the collective. But the agoge did not stop at physical hardening. It aimed for the colonization of the mind. The crypteia, often described as a secret police force, was in reality a ritualized terror campaign and the final exam of the Spartan education. Promising youths were sent into the countryside armed only with a dagger and instructed to survive by their wits and to murder helots, the enslaved population upon whose labor Sparta depended. This was not war, it was a cull. It was a state-sanctioned serial killing designed to blood the young warriors and terrorize the slave class into submission. The theological horror of the crypteia lies in its intimacy. The Spartan youth had to stalk his victim, observe him, and kill him at close quarters. It required the suspension of all human empathy, a deliberate deadening of the soul to ensure that the state's survival was placed above the sanctity of life. The Spartan system also waged war on fear itself. Through rituals of isolation and nighttime terrors, boys were forced to confront the primal fear of the dark and the unknown. They were sent into the wilderness, stripped of sensory input, and made to navigate the world as ghosts. This education of the shadows produced the legendary Spartan silence, the laconic speech that was not a sign of dullness, but of extreme self-control. A Spartan spoke only when necessary because he had been trained to view words, like movements, as expenditures of energy that could be fatal if wasted. The result of this totalizing system was the Spartan hoplite, a warrior of unmatched discipline and terrifying efficiency, but a human being who had been hollowed out. The agoge succeeded in creating the perfect weapon, but in doing so, it created a culture that was sterile, incapable of the artistic, philosophical, or political innovations that defined the rest of the Greek world. Sparta produced no Parthenon, no Socrates, no tragedies. It produced only soldiers and the silence of the grave. It serves as a grim warning of what happens when a society sacrifices the individual entirely on the altar of security, creating a state that is invulnerable from without, but dead from within. From the muddy roads of medieval Europe to the phantom womb of a Tudor queen, from the golden tents of Susa to the silent terror of the Spartan wilderness, we see a common thread: the desperate, often tragic, human attempt to impose order on a chaotic world. We build temporary structures that become permanent prisons. We legislate unity that cannot be enforced. We sacrifice our children to the state in the name of safety. History, in this light, is not just a record of events, but a mirror reflecting our own perpetual struggle to find permanence in a world defined by change. If the trial of isolation stripped the Spartan boy of his dependency on others, the final test, the helot hunt, was designed to strip him of his humanity, replacing the moral hesitation of the child with the cold, predatory calculus of the state. This was the culmination of the agoge, a secret rite that existed in the whispers of the barracks long before the youth was ever tapped on the shoulder and told to vanish into the night. It is here, in the darkness of the Laconian countryside, that the theological implications of the Spartan project become most terrifyingly clear. Where most societies initiate their young into adulthood through ceremonies of community and blessing, Sparta initiated them through an act of sanctioned murder, a baptism not of water, but of blood. The youth, armed only with a dagger and the cloak that had been his only shelter for years, was not sent to kill a beast, but a man, specifically a helot, a member of the enslaved population that outnumbered the Spartans 7-1, and whose labor fed the very machine that oppressed them. The target was often chosen not for their weakness, but for their strength. A helot who stood too tall, spoke too boldly, or showed a spark of leadership was marked for culling. And the young Spartan was the instrument of this political pruning. We must visualize the scene to understand the gravity of this transition. The boy, now a young man, moving through the landscape with the silence he had perfected during the years of theft and hunger, his senses tuned to the frequency of the victim's breath. This was not the chaotic glory of the phalanx, where shoulder presses against shoulder and courage is a collective resource. This was a solitary descent into the abyss of violence. He had to track his quarry, memorize their habits, wait for the moon to be obscured by clouds, and strike with a precision that precluded any cry for help. The kill had to be absolute. A wounded helot could scream, could alert the village, could turn the hunter into the hunted. Thus, the Spartan youth learned that the highest form of violence was not the one that roared, but the one that whispered. When the deed was done, and the life had left the eyes of the man whose only crime was his potential for defiance, the youth did not return to a hero's welcome. There were no laurels, no public praises sung in the marketplace. He returned to the shadows from which he came, met only with the grim, knowing nod of the elders. The silence of the act was its own seal. He had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He had proven that he could place the abstract needs of the state above the visceral reality of human life. He was no longer a boy. He was a spartiate, a peer, a brick in the wall of the city. This, then, brings us to the profound and unsettling synthesis of the histories we have traversed together. We began with the medieval world, a civilization that stumbled into its traditions, creating permanent institutions out of temporary accidents, the town crier born of illiteracy, the bell born of wandering cows, the bread laws born of famine. These were the products of human frailty and the inability to plan, a chaotic accumulation of good enough solutions that hardened into the bedrock of society. The medieval man lived in a world shaped by mistakes he simply forgot to correct. Contrast this with the Spartan world, which was the antithesis of accident. Sparta was a civilization of terrifying intentionality. Nothing in the agoge was accidental. Every pang of hunger, every shiver of cold, every drop of blood was calculated by the state to produce a specific outcome. Where the medieval world drifted into its future, Sparta marched into it with ironclad purpose. And yet, looking at them side by side, we must ask the theologian's question: which was the greater tragedy? The medieval world, for all its filth and confusion, allowed for the organic, messy growth of humanity, the tavern tab that bound neighbors together, the feast days that interrupted labor with joy, the nicknames that captured a moment of humor. It was a world where the temporary became permanent because people were busy living. Sparta, in its quest for the perfect, permanent warrior, strangled the very life it sought to protect. By engineering a society that eliminated the accidental, they also eliminated the beautiful, the spontaneous, and the humane. They achieved their permanence, yes, the Spartan legend endures, but at the cost of their soul. And between these two extremes, the accidental permanence of the medievals and the forced permanence of the Spartans, we find the tragic figures of Mary Tudor and Alexander the Great. Individuals who tried to impose their own will upon the river of time and failed. Mary, driven by the trauma of her shattered family and the burning conviction of her faith, tried to force England back to Rome, to make the temporary restoration of Catholicism a permanent reality through the sheer force of her desire and the fires of Smithfield. She failed because she misunderstood the nature of her people and the irreversibility of history. She was a woman trying to hold back the tide with her bare hands. And her phantom pregnancies were the heartbreaking somatic manifestation of her inability to birth the future she craved. Alexander, possessed by a vision of a unified world, tried to marry East and West at Susa, believing that a ceremony of gold and incense could erase centuries of cultural hatred. He, too, failed, because he believed that the will of a king could rewrite the identity of a subject. His empire fractured the moment his breath left his body, proving that unity cannot be decreed, only grown. What connects the town crier, the Spartan assassin, the weeping queen, and the conqueror at Susa is the human relationship with time. We are creatures who live in the temporary. Our lives are like grass that withers, as the psalmist says, yet we are obsessed with the permanent. We build stone castles on temporary ditches. We write eternal laws for temporary crises. We forge iron souls to protect fragile cities. The medieval peasant accepted the temporary and let it rot into tradition. The Spartan fought the temporary and became a monster of discipline. Mary Tudor and Alexander tried to conquer the temporary and were destroyed by it. It serves as a humbling meditation on our own modern condition. We, too, create our temporary solutions, our quick fixes, our emergency measures, our compromises, and we watch them slowly, imperceptibly, become the cages in which we live. The history of the world is not just the story of great men and battles. It is the story of the temporary things that refuse to leave, the guests who overstayed their welcome by 1,000 years, and the desperate struggle of the human spirit to find a foothold in the shifting sands of time. We look back at the straw on the tavern floor and laugh, yet we walk on the metaphorical straw of our own ancestors' decisions, adding our own layers of debris, hoping that it will hold. Consider the profound existential weight of the surname, a concept we accept today as a fixed anchor of identity, yet which began as a fleeting joke in a muddy village square. In the theological sense, to name something is to claim dominion over it, a practice dating back to the Garden of Eden. But in the medieval context, the naming process was not an act of divine authority, but of communal convenience and, often, casual cruelty. When we reflect on the transition of John the Bald, from a descriptive moniker for a man suffering from alopecia to the hereditary Mr. Bald, we witness the calcification of a moment. The medieval society, in its lack of foresight, condemned future generations to bear the burden of an ancestor's physical trait, profession, or scandalous blunder. It suggests a world where the individual was not an autonomous island, but a mere extension of their lineage, trapped in the amber of a scribe's impatient quill. The surname bastard, which exists to this day, is perhaps the cruelest relic of this system, a permanent branding of a child's illegitimate origin that no amount of subsequent virtue could erase. It is a form of secular original sin, passed down not through blood, but through bureaucracy. This accidental permanence of identity stands in stark contrast to the fluid, chaotic reality of the lives they lived, where a man could be a baker one day and a soldier the next, yet his name would forever chain him to the oven. Now, let us place this medieval fixation on labeling alongside the Spartan obsession with erasing the label. If the medieval world accidentally trapped men in their individual quirks, Sparta intentionally pulverized the individual into dust, leaving only the state. The agoge was not merely a training ground, it was a machine for the annihilation of the ego. When the Spartan boy stole through the night, starving and shivering, he was not learning to be Leonidas or Lysander. He was learning to be Sparta itself. The silence he practiced, the laconic brevity, was the auditory manifestation of a suppressed self. In a room full of Spartans, there was no chatter, no idle gossip, no town crier announcing the news, because the individual voice was considered a waste of resources. The only voice that mattered was the collective roar of the phalanx. This creates a haunting dichotomy. The medieval world was noisy, messy, and filled with the clanging of bells and the shouting of criers, a cacophony of individual struggle trying to find order. The Spartan world was silent, ordered, and terrifyingly efficient, a monolith where the individual struggle was silenced before it could even begin. One society drowned in its own noise, the other suffocated in its own silence. We must also revisit the tab, that seemingly trivial mechanism of the tavern, to understand the economic theology of the medieval soul. The transformation of a temporary debt into a hereditary obligation mirrors the theological concept of ancestral sin, but played out in pints of ale and broken stools. It reveals a society where the past was never truly past. Just as a king could not delete a law banning fish sales, a son could not delete his father's thirst. The tab bound the community together in a web of mutual obligation that was impossible to escape. The tavern keeper, holding the book of debts, became a secular recording angel, keeping a ledger of vice that would outlive the sinner. This inability to reset the clock, to wipe the slate clean, is a defining feature of the medieval experience. They lived in a world of accumulation, accumulated laws, accumulated straw on the floor, accumulated debts, accumulated sins. There was no fresh start, only the piling up of history until it became a geological layer under one's feet, And what of the feast day? Here lies the tension between the sacred and the profane, the temporary reprieve that became a permanent paralysis of productivity. The Church, in its wisdom, established days of rest to honor the saints, to remind the laborer that he was more than a beast of burden. But the human appetite for leisure and for ale transformed the calendar into a minefield of obligation. When a third of the year is given over to feasting, the holy day loses its sanctity and becomes a loophole. The peasant did not celebrate the saint's piety, he celebrated the saint's permission to stop working. It was a temporary halt to labor that occurred with such frequency, it threatened the very harvest it was meant to bless. This creates a paradox. A society that was deeply religious, yet used religion as the primary excuse to avoid the curse of Adam, which is toil. The temporary joy of the feast became the permanent rhythm of the year, a cycle of fasting and binging that defined the biological and spiritual clock of Europe. Furthermore, let us consider the architecture of the castle kitchen once more, not just as a structural failure, but as a testament to the prioritization of war over sustenance. The fact that a kitchen, the source of life, was often a temporary shack shoved next to a latrine or in a hallway, while the fortifications were built of stone for eternity, tells us everything we need to know about the medieval value system. Survival against violence was the primary objective. Survival against hunger or disease was a secondary, improvised concern. They planned for the siege, but they improvised the dinner. This mindset, the permanent preparation for war and the temporary arrangement for life, echoes through history, finding its grim reflection in the Spartan barracks, where the only permanent thing was the discipline of the soldier, and the life of the individual was the most temporary, expendable thing of all. As we wade deeper into these currents of history, we see that the tragic flaw of Mary Tudor was her inability to accept the temporary nature of her own power. She tried to use the temporary tool of the stake to build an eternal church, forgetting that ash washes away with the rain. She tried to use the temporary vessel of her body to produce a permanent dynasty, but biology is a cruel mistress who does not bow to the needs of the state. And Alexander, standing amidst the gold of Susa, tried to use the temporary ceremony of marriage to fuse two eternal enemies, failing to see that while bodies can be joined in an instant, souls take generations to merge. The temporary is not just a measurement of time, it is a quality of the human condition. We are all, in a sense, temporary structures, hasty improvisations of flesh and bone, trying to build something that will outlast the winter. Let us turn our gaze now to the vanity of the human form, where the tension between the temporary and the permanent manifests in the peculiar history of medieval fashion, a realm where a single mistake could dictate the aesthetic of a century. In the theological understanding of the body, it is a temple, yet in the medieval court, it was a canvas for errors masquerading as trends. Consider the tonsure, that ring of shaved hair that defined the monastic look for a millennium, marking the wearer as a man set apart for God. While we imbue it with deep symbolism, the crown of thorns, the rejection of worldly vanity, there is a subversive historical theory that it began as a barber's catastrophe. Imagine the scene: a novice monk, a slip of the razor, a bald patch where none should be. In a rational world, one waits for the hair to grow back. In the medieval world, one declares it a divine sign, a new standard of holiness, and suddenly thousands of men are shaving their heads in imitation of an accident. It is the sanctification of the error. This pattern repeats in the secular world with the shaved foreheads of noblewomen. A single influential aristocrat, perhaps attempting to fix an uneven hairline or suffering from a skin condition, shaves her brow. Rather than facing the ridicule of the court, a place as vicious as any Spartan mess hall, she declares it the height of beauty. The temporary fix for a bad hair day becomes the permanent standard of elegance, forcing generations of women to pluck their hairlines in a painful ritual of conformity. It reveals a society paralyzed by the fear of being an outlier. If the Duke wears a cone on his head because he lost a bet or hid a scar, then we must all wear cones. It is the Emperor's new clothes, but played out in hairstyles that lasted not for a parade, but for decades. This desperate need to attach meaning to the arbitrary extends to the battlefield, specifically in the evolution of the flag. To the military historian, the flag begins as a purely functional object, a rally point in the dust and chaos of the melee. It was a temporary marker, a piece of colored cloth on a stick saying, "Here is the commander, do not stab him." It had no soul. It was a traffic sign, yet the human heart is an idol-making factory. Soldiers, desperate for something to believe in amidst the slaughter, projected their loyalty onto the cloth. The temporary marker became the regimental color, a sacred object that men would die to protect. The loss of the flag was not just a tactical inconvenience, it was a spiritual catastrophe, a fall from grace. We see here the birth of nationalism, the worship of the symbol over the substance. The flag, which was meant to be put away when the battle ended, became a permanent totem of the state, embroidered with lions and eagles, demanding blood sacrifice. It is a profound shift from the utilitarian to the sacramental, proving that human beings cannot handle the mere existence of things. We must enchant them, we must give them eternal weight, even if they are just rags on poles. And if we look at the macrocosm of the medieval world, we see this accidental permanence etched into the very stones of the cities. We marvel today at the twisting, illogical streets of old European capitals, finding them charming or romantic. But the urban planner knows the truth. These are not streets. They are fossilized paths between squatter huts. A medieval city often began not with a blueprint, but with a construction site. Workers arrived to build a cathedral or a castle, a project that might take a century, and they built temporary shacks to sleep in. They were supposed to leave. They didn't. The merchant came to sell them ale, the smith came to shoe their horses, and the temporary camp became a neighborhood. The spaces between the huts, where the mud was churned by boots, became the roads. When the huts were eventually replaced by timber and stone, the footprint remained. The city was not designed, it occurred. It was a pop-up settlement that forgot to pop down. This touches on a deep sociological truth. Civilization is often just a temporary arrangement that solidified because no one had the energy to move. We are living in the ruins of our ancestors' procrastination. Now, contrast this organic, messy, accidental growth of the medieval city with the ruthless, manicured sterility of the Spartan ideal. Sparta did not have squatter camps, Sparta had barracks. The distinct lack of monumental architecture in Sparta compared to Athens is telling. They did not build great stone temples or theaters because their monument was the men themselves. They viewed the physical city as secondary to the human city. A Spartan king, when asked why the city lacked walls, pointed to his soldiers and said, "These are the walls of Sparta." It is a powerful sentiment, but it reveals a terrifying transience. When the men died, the walls fell. Athens built the Parthenon, a permanent testament to beauty that survives today. Sparta built soldiers, temporary vessels of violence that turned to dust. The medieval city, with its winding streets born of squalor and accident, survives and functions today. The Spartan city, built on rigid discipline and the rejection of the accidental, is largely gone, leaving behind only the ghost of a reputation. There is a lesson here for the theologian. The messy, broken, accidental efforts of humanity, the straw on the floor approach to life, often possess a resilience that the rigid, perfected systems of the ideologues do not. The weed survives where the cultivated rose dies. We must also reconsider the chicken in the living room, not just as a humorous anecdote of peasant life, but as a violation of the boundary between man and beast. In the book of Genesis, man is given dominion over the animals, a separation of order. The medieval peasant, driven by the temporary crisis of winter, collapsed this separation. The chicken entered the domestic sphere, and in doing so, altered the anthropology of the home. The home was no longer a sanctuary of humans, it was a barn with a hearth. This temporary invasion of the animal kingdom became a permanent state of cohabitation, reminding the medieval man daily of his own proximity to the earth. He could not pretend to be a being of pure intellect when he was waking up to the clucking of a hen on his chest. It grounded him, quite literally, in the muck of creation. Compare this to Alexander the Great, who tried to elevate himself to the status of a god, to separate himself from the muck. He refused the chicken in the living room of his own mortality. He tried to transcend his Macedonian roots, his human limitations, and his cultural boundaries. And in doing so, he lost touch with the reality that his soldiers lived in. The peasant with the chicken knew who he was. Alexander, with his empire and his golden weddings, forgot. In the end, the history of these temporary things is a history of human adaptation. We are a species that excels at making do. We put a bell on the cow, we throw straw on the mud, we shave our heads to hide a mistake, we marry our enemies to stop the war. We are constantly patching the holes in the fabric of reality. The tragedy and the comedy arises when we forget that the patch was never meant to be the whole cloth. We worship the patch. We enshrine the mistake. We build a theology around the bell. And perhaps in the eyes of the divine, this is our most endearing and frustrating quality, our ability to find meaning in the mess, to build a tradition out of a panic, and to call it civilization.